Hey, what's happening, YouTubes? And this is Trent, and it is 2019, and you know what that means. It means it's time to update my Photoshop brush pack. Yes, that's right. All the magic of my universe can be at your fingertips, your digital fingertips, by clicking on that Gumroad link. I should also mention that you can make your own brushes. These are just the ones that I use, and I've made it really easy for you to just grab them and drop them into Photoshop and have the ones that I use if you should find that you want to draw along with me. I haven't updated my brushes in a couple of years, so I want to do a little video walkthrough of just like what brushes I'm using this year. Everything I've been using. I made a couple of custom brushes and added them to them. Of course, you can also, if you get that, you can get all the previous year's Photoshop brushes as well. So if you're looking at my old World of Warcraft concept art and you're like, how do I render the way that Trent rendered back in the day? Well, this is my Warcrafty brush here. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a new layer so we can like draw on top of this. So this is really just a hard round that has the pressure sensitivity set to the scale and the opacity. And so where does that come in handy? It comes in handy if you're doing something like you want a full opacity here, you color dab on that, and then you get a little bit of a lighter one, and then you color dab on that, you get a little bit of a lighter one. You get these kind of hard edges, and this works really well if you use like a smudge tool, this one over here, with that. It'll blend it a little bit more, but you want to pick a nicer, let's see, I use this one to blend my colors a little bit more. If you wanted to soften some of those edges. As you know, if you're a skilled painter, edge contrast is a very important thing. So this is really nice if you're starting with a hard edged kind of contrast and you want to smooth out your softer edges later. But I steered away from rendering in this style in my more recent stuff, just to get away from the more hard-edged, contrasty kind of rendering and get a little bit softer. So that's when I switched over to the very similar hard square, which is really kind of similar, except that the size is not set to pressure sensitivity. It's just the opacity. And so I kind of render it the same way, where I color dab a lot. I've always got my finger resting on the Alt key. And yeah, so the harder you press, the more opacity you get. So if I have like this color selected and I press really hard, I get full opacity. If I press very light, I get light opacity, and it kind of does that on the fly. So it allows me to color blend very quickly. And I do a lot of kind of painting over things. But then you get these like kind of very Photoshop-y looking edges on things that are a little too crisp and clean, and I don't like those these days. So I really only sketch with this brush, and then I use something with a little bit more grain to, which is my third brush here, a little bit more grain to add a little bit more of an organic look to things. And that's where you get these kind of, you get a little bit more of like a almost paper grain to it. I should zoom in so you can see. And there's a little bit of noise on that. It's got a little bit of a paper texture to it, but not so much. And it also has a softer edge so that you get less of those kind of hard, you see here, like, see that where it's like kind of a hard corner on things. A lot less of that with these sort of softer round brushes. This one also has the pressure sensitivity set to opacity. So if you're pressing at full pressure, you're going to get that full color. But if you're barely pressing, you're going to get a nice color blend there. And then I color dab to smooth it out. That's how you get it all buttery, like I like to do with the smudge. I also use a lot more of these kind of like grainy pencil brushes, as you can see. And this one's very similar to the next one, but just this second one has a little bit more grain to it, as you can see. So it feels like a little bit of like a dry brush. It's like a real world grainy dry brush, which is kind of handy. And of course, you got your standard airbrush. The way that I use my standard airbrush is, yeah, sometimes I just color dab and use it to smooth my transitions. But more often than not, I'm using it in conjunction with a selection. So for instance, like if I were going to paint an eyeball, I might do that. And then like I might grab the darker color. This is a pretty common process these days, especially for that kind of anime, soft painted anime look like Sakimi-chan gets or Zeronis. And so it's basically an alternating between the selection tool and the airbrush tool, and creating your shapes, really. You're painting your shapes rather than painting lines, that sort of a thing. And this is really almost more like painting like a sculptor or something, where you're painting in all of your shadows using selections and thinking of your object more as shapes than as lines. And there are some artists who paint almost entirely with that, just the airbrush and the selection tool. I'm not going to cover that too much here, but that's how I use the airbrush and selection tools. Next up, we have a brush that is sort of like a wispy, oily brush, although it doesn't have a lot of texture to it. This one is particularly great. Hang on, accidentally grabbed the edge of the window there. This one's particularly great for doing things like wispy hair and things like that, because it has a nice brushy, like a dry brush feel to it. Although I do have other ones in this set that I feel like get that job done maybe just a little bit better. But it's great for adding a couple of wispy dry brush strokes to your drawings. And then of course I do a lot of like cutting off, kind of using a cut off approach with the brushes. This is like a graffiti technique or an oil brush technique where you use a bigger brush than what you need, and then you go in and cut it off. So for instance, if you want something to come to a point, you would do this kind of a big brush stroke and then you would cut it that way, and then you get this interesting kind of a streak. That's just sort of a technique that you develop as you learn to paint a lot more. And I don't want to go too much into that in this video. This is just about the brushes themselves. This one is a chisel brush that I developed. I was trying to emulate something that Ashley Wood does in his digital illustrations. A lot of people might not realize that he did a lot of his like Metal Gear stuff using Photoshop. And this one, the way I use it is that I actually try to go in. This is also something that Peter Lee over at Blizzard Entertainment does a lot, or he used to back like 10 years ago. I don't know anymore. But it's basically you go in and you actually rotate out your chisel in the direction and angle that you want for whatever it is that you're drawing. And this gets you a very interesting organic looking effect, which I personally just freaking love. And especially when I'm feeling like if I feel like my images are looking too mechanical or something, I'll go in and do something like this. And what it does is it's sort of like, it simulates if you've ever worked with real oils or you've ever worked with real acrylics. A lot of times, if you watch the old Bob Ross stuff, he'll use a chisel, he'll use a palette knife. And this is really kind of like a painting with a palette knife. So I like to use that one to get these very kind of interesting, swoopy, more organic looking brush strokes. I mean, especially compared to this one, you remember we were just looking at a minute ago. Look at how blobby that can look versus like what kind of a cool, dynamic, like energized brush stroke you can get using this palette knife chisel brush. I mean, you've seen some of the kind of energy that I've gotten out of this in some of my own paintings here on the YouTube channel as well. So now it can be yours, of course. Get swooshy, get swooshy. Okay, next up we've got another really organic looking oily brush. This one particularly is really a little bit more streaky, you'll notice, compared to this one that's a lot more grainy. It uses a similar shape for the brush, but it has a little bit more streakiness to it. It's really good for getting your piece to look like you used real bristly brushes in your painting process. So I like that one for that one, but I don't use it all the time. Sometimes I like a little bit more of a cleaner look. This one is really when I want to go nuts with the brushy bristles. This one is almost like a sumi-e brush. So if you're familiar with like Japanese style painting, like the old stuff, old stuff, the stuff those geezers used to make of like the misty mountains and things like that, they used a lot of like what was called sumi-e. So I was really just trying to create my own sumi-e brush when I made this one. And it's just a kind of a wiry, spindly. It's got some randomized bristles that will just kind of streak out in unexpected ways. And it's quite well known that the magic of the universe unfolds between every rogue brush bristle that goes awry. So, just to let you know that I've got you covered on the magic of the universe front, you know, with this Photoshop brush set. This one is for cleaning up similar sorts of things. This is a blend between my chisel or palette knife brush and my textured brush. So this gets you a lot of noise. And you can actually paint with this one. I found it's actually a pretty good one to paint with, especially if you're doing the rotation on things, you know. It gets you a nice noise. If you're familiar with my Bandito Swordsman painting that I did like 5 years ago, I still use this brush, man. It's just it's one that's sort of like a comfort to me for adding a little bit of noise without being too, oh my gosh, I've made his nose too dark. Without being too noisy and without being too much of a palette knife too. This one is really just for adding noise almost exclusively. I really don't use that one very much. It's mostly there. When I do use it, I create a new layer, and then I'll do something like this, and then I'll set that to multiply, or yeah, something like a multiply. I'll add in my texture using this to get like a very like kind of feels like a canvas kind of a feel, and it's set to multiply, so it's kind of looking ugly right now. But if you back that off and then you do like an erase on it, especially if your eraser has a texture to it, you see how suddenly it kind of all feels a little bit more like it's on a canvas or something like that, because it's got a little bit more texture than just that smooth airbrushy feel. See, let me zoom in so you can really see what I'm talking about. You see this like texture type of stuff? That's really all I use that particular brush for, is to get like a little bit of a paper grain noise. And there are other easier ways to do that. So that's a brush that I may end up phasing out actually. But I kept it in there for you guys because maybe you want to like figure out how I did some stuff on previous illustrations. We got a lot of treats in this brush pack, so let's keep moving on. This one is really pretty much the same dealio. No need to cover it other than, you know, that it does it a little bit more flat, and it has a little bit more of an opacity effect on it. So this one is a little bit more useful in that you can color select and control it a little bit more because of the opacity on it. And it also does a little bit less of that color jitter that bugs me about the previous brush. This one is a really good grain brush, a really good noisy brush. If you haven't really noticed, I don't use these very much. Most of what you see me use is those top brushes, those top maybe 10 brushes. But when you really want to get like some paper in there or just a little bit of a grain so that it feels more natural, that's what this one's in here for, because I really like that stuff that feels like it's drawn on paper. This one is legendary for a few different reasons, but it's a fantastic brush for adding large clumpy spatters of paint, especially when you're color dabbing and you're just trying to get some texture in there. But I also use it, this is my #1 go-to brush for when I use the Smudge Tool. And I'll show you what I mean. Let me merge everything down here. And then I've got my Smudge Tool selected, and you can use any brush in conjunction with the Smudge Tool. If you select this one and you smudge, oh, that's buttery. Like, that is so smooth. Look at that. You get such cool blended results. Next up is my cloud brush. Oops, I'm still on my smudge. Make sure that you switch back to a regular brush and then go to the cloud brush. This one's excellent for creating misty morning clouds. I'll show you what I mean real quick. It's got just a little bit of a texture to it, which is handy. Let's add some blue in here. Really excellent for a soft faded kind of sky or clouds. Really useful for that. Really useful for soft transitions, because if you'll notice, look at this cool little texturing thing that happens in between around the edges of things. That's so nice. You can imagine the value you can get out of that. Like that's really neat for adding atmosphere. So that one's one that I actually do use a lot. Mostly for texturing and things. Of course, we've got my standard grass brushes that I made years and years ago. These are super handy. Just make sure to draw left to right. And this one's for adding a little bit more texture to your grassy areas. So obviously we have the chain brush, which is super useful if you haven't seen this already. One brush stroke creates the whole chain. I've got 2 different chain brushes in here. I've done videos on how you can make your own repeating chain brush patterns. It's freaking magical, especially if you're doing something like drawing Ghost Rider or something like that. Or if you're drawing like torture chambers for Diablo. Super useful. Yeah. I also have beads. This is particularly good if you're drawing things like monks or if you're trying to decorate patterns on some of your characters and things like that. This will follow your brush, but it creates a little bit of a color variation based on whatever color you have selected. We've got this one here is also kind of like my my palette knife brush, except that when you press hard, you can see it's got like some streaks in it. And that adds a little bit of texture, although to be quite honest, this is one that I don't use it very much anymore. It is interesting for getting a very graphical look, but it's not one that's in my usual routine anymore. It could be something that you use, though, if you were so inclined. That's why I've chosen to include it, because it's something that I used in some of my older paintings. And if you really like some of my older painting style, it's still in there. Still something you can use. This one adds a buttload of just texture to things. Of course, I like to use it as a sort of a scattering texture brush. You can see that what I do is I go through and I grab like a color that I want to blend. If I want to blend it in a very organic, natural, kind of noisy way, I'm using the color dabber and just selecting the colors that I want to blend it with, and kind of hitting little spots, and then it kind of scatters it. So it really just, think of it like you're adding salt to watercolor painting and just seeing like the colors just sort of explode in that little section. And it uses the paper texture as well, so you end up with this very organic looking, like this will look cool, watch. Just explode it, especially if you want like a very energized, inky, noisy look. Oh yeah, like that is a really cool way to like blend your colors and scatter them. This one is another noisy brush, really great for adding like those final touches of spatters of paint. If you like my Galaxy's Edge covers, for example, you're going to be more than familiar with this one, because I've been using it a lot more lately. It really just creates as if you were to take a color like a paint and load it up onto a toothbrush and then just splatter that toothbrush. I use it for whites if I'm using a high contrast white or something like that, or something like this. If I want it to look like that's an oil splatter or something like that, I really just use this brush. It's like a toothbrush paint spatter. More texture brushes. This one's good for creating something that feels like maybe I'm running out of room to really see things here. This one looks like it's sort of a leather, kind of subtle leather pattern or something like that, but really great for adding a bit of texture to your paintings. It's just one that I use. Little fibers, I guess, is what it sort of feels like, as if you'd taken a paper towel and dabbed it on your wet paint. If you don't want to paint your own trees or something like that, you can really just create, of course, a brush that does all of your leaves and then clusters them. This particular one, the harder you press, the more solid the color becomes. So I'm just going to like paint in a little tree here in the background. And by the way, I'm not doing an actual painting here. I'm really just trying to showcase some of the brushes that I have in my set, in combination with other brushes, like any old thing like this thing, maybe, for instance. You can get some pretty neat, this will be our tree. If you were to combine this with some photo bashing or something like that, this would really save you just a load of time. As you can see, you get like a tree really quickly. Let's go back to our brushes, our leaf brushes. Maybe get some scattered. Bam, ba, bam. There you go. So there you go. As you can see, you get a tree pretty fast there as a matter of less than 30 seconds. So let's see, where did we leave off? We're coming up towards the end here. This is really good noise brush for creating. One, you can use it as edging for some of your elements if you want it to feel more spattered. You can use it to create tree lines if you had a lot of dead trees in the distance. You could use it to create a leathery texture on some of your surfaces, or like maybe even like characters if you wanted to make a little bit of a more of an organic skin tone that feels a little bit less, or not skin tone, but a skin texture that feels a little bit less like brush strokes and a little bit more like organic, I guess. But yeah, it's basically just spindly little wires of trees and nerves. This is my watercolor brush, which I've set it to normal instead of a multiply because I really want it to kind of like have a full opacity when I press full pressure. I didn't want it to just keep getting darker and darker like a buildup. I wanted something that felt like it has some opacity to it. So that's why it's set to like a full opacity. It's just my personal choice on it. You could, if you wanted to make it more like a real watercolor, you could just set that to multiply. But my problem is that things just get a little too dark too fast, metaphorically and literally. I'm going to hit the time lapse here and just jam for a little bit. Oh. And of course, last up, I've used this brush in Sketchbook Pro for some time. That's like a very oily kind of a brush, and I've been trying to capture that really spattery, oily brush in Photoshop with very little luck. But in the process, I found a way to kind of make this very organic, noisy, textured kind of a brush that I've been getting more and more comfortable with using, especially for sketching. Of course, it's just a little bit uncontrolled, so use at your own risk. But if you can wrangle it, this brush is a beast for sure. Super useful, super noisy, super organic and clustered. Especially when you're barely touching anything, you get like some kind of random things going on, which I personally love. I've been digging into a lot more, as you can tell with this brush set, a lot more of that like unexpected happy accidents. The more I can create those using digital, the happier I am with the paintings that I'm doing. So now all of this, of course, is something that you can play around with and you can modify and use however the heck you want. I don't really care. I'd love to see what you do with these brushes. If you create something awesome that you're super proud of, please do share that with me over on my Twitter channel, and I will retweet that and show it off if it's something that I feel like others can benefit from as well. So dudes, that about wraps up my 2019 brush set tour. If you've purchased any of my brush sets for Photoshop in the past, this one's a free download for you. You've already purchased it. You just buy my brushes, so you already got it. Just go to Gumroad and hit the download again, and you can pick up all of my old brushes as well, my old brush sets. Dudes, don't forget to subscribe. I love having you around. Thank you so much. 2018 was just an amazing year. 2019, here we go. It's going to be a really awesome year for my channel. I got so many cool things planned. Oh my God, I can't wait to share it with you. And dudes, until next time, I'll catch y'all. Bon yonder bon, and ciao, baby. Oh, yeah.